In this video, we're going to show you how to install Cook's stepped primary long tube headers on this 2018 Mustang using hand tools, in a garage, and with the car on jack stands. Rather than bore you with every little step, we're going to hit the high points and give you some tips and tricks we learned along the way. We weren't sure how high the car would need to be to install these headers, so we used some extra tall jack stands. This helped us take videos, but in retrospect, we probably could have done it on standard jack stands. First, we removed the battery cover, battery box, and access panel so we could reach the header bolts on the back right-hand corner of the engine. Moving under the car, we removed the starter. It's pretty straightforward with the factory exhaust in place. We then disconnected the factory oxygen sensors. Oxygen sensors can be hard to remove with the exhaust installed, so we decided to remove them from the factory exhaust later. Then we disconnected the factory downpipes from the rest of the exhaust. We already had a zipper pipe installed, so our car had an additional cut in the exhaust, so we could keep the cats connected to the headers on both sides. If you're feeling lucky, you can try to disconnect the cats from the factory headers, but we wouldn't recommend it because those bolts are super rusty, and you may round them off, and then you're screwed. It's better to try to remove the factory headers and cats as an assembly if you can. Because the engine mounts need to come off, the Cook's instructions say to support the engine from the top. But with the Vortex supercharger, there's a lot going on here. Supporting the engine from the top also restricts access to the header bolts. Instead, we're going to support the engine from the bottom. The instructions say not to support the engine from the oil pan, and they're right. Never, ever support the engine by an oil pan. There's a better way. We could have jacked up on the block itself just ahead of the bell housing, but instead we're going to use a support block via these pads on the bell housing. We've done this on other Mustangs with the MT82 transmission, and it works great. We made a support cradle out of a 4x4 and two 2x4s to spread the load across the bell housing, and used a floor jack to raise the engine. Here are the dimensions of the support cradle that we made. This method works like a charm. It's easy to raise and lower the engine and allows total access to the engine. We're going to need all the working room that we can get for this header install. Swivels, impact sockets, and long extension bars are handy. While the fasteners aren't hard to access, they're not a straight shot. This saves time. Here you can see these tools in action, removing the engine mount nuts and engine mounts. All of the factory header nuts need a 15mm socket or wrench. To gain access between the head and the frame rails, we had to remove most of the passenger side exhaust studs as well, and we used an external Torx socket for that. One of the studs is too close to the air conditioning compressor line for the Torx socket, so we used a 1/4-inch box end wrench to remove that stud. We left the top rear stud in place and removed the factory passenger side header and catalyst as an assembly. On the driver's side, we disconnected the steering shaft from the rack for better access before removing all the nuts. Surprisingly, we didn't need to remove any of the studs on the driver's side to get the factory manifold and catalyst off. Leaving the O2 sensors in place until now was the right decision. We used an oxygen sensor socket for this job. We weren't sure if it mattered, so we marked the right side sensors with a paint dot so we didn't mix them up on installation. If you're feeling lucky, you can also use a 22mm open end wrench and whack it with a hammer to knock the sensors loose. But good luck. Before installing the Cook's headers, we compare them to the factory parts. We're not going to lie, the factory parts do a great job making power while being manufacturable, easy to install, and keep emissions squeaky clean. But ultimate power was not the priority. The factory manifold's short, unequal primary tubes and asymmetric collectors restrict ultimate power. And frankly, they sound how they look. They are the reason the Ford Coyote engines sound kinda weird, because the manifolds are kinda weird. The Cook's headers feature stepped primaries, 3-inch collectors, and equal-ish primary tubes. They're the reason they sound incredible on Coyote engines. To get into the details of these headers, follow the video link above. The catalytic converters are also much smaller on the Cook's setup. That's going to make a big difference in sound. Even though Cook's includes enough Stage 8 header bolts to replace all the studs, we've found the factory studs and metal locking nuts do an excellent job of keeping everything tight, so we reused them wherever we could. On the passenger side, we installed the top studs and hung the supplied multi-layer metal gasket from those studs. The slotted holes on the Cook's header flange made slipping the header into place simple and easy. All the factory studs and nuts worked on the passenger side. While some people reinstall the starter and don't install the top header bolt, we think that's just lazy. You can either use an extension that's the right length to fit between the starter and the engine mount, or you can use a stubby ratchet and reach around the back of the bell housing and tighten it that way. The fastener situation on the driver's side header is a little more complex because there's not enough clearance between the tubes and the head for the factory studs to fit. They're too long and hit the tubes before you can tighten anything down. Instead, we used a combination of factory studs at the front and the supplied Stage 8 bolts at the back along the top and hung the MLS gasket from them before installing the driver's side header. Along the bottom, we used factory studs at the front and included Stage 8 bolts at the rear, again for clearance reasons. Note how the tabs on the Stage 8 bolts are positioned so they don't let the bolt loosen. This was the only real tough one. Access to the upper rear bolt on the driver's side is so difficult, we couldn't use the supplied locking tab or clip. In retrospect, we could have drilled a hole in this one and safety wired it, but we'll just check the tightness of this bolt every few months, just in case. Finally, we connected the headers to our zipper pipe exhaust system using the green catted connection pipes and installed the oxygen sensors. So you see, everything was straightforward and we didn't need a lift or any crazy tools to install these headers. Nothing was impossible. All it took was some time, common sense, a few different kinds of wrenches, and a lot of patience. Overall, we are very pleased with how this header system installed. Stay tuned for the next video where we compare the sound of the factory manifolds and our zipper pipe exhaust with these Cook's headers.